It began, as most dangerous loves do, in silence. The kind of silence that trembles at the edge of what cannot be said aloud. The kind that fills the halls of palaces with rumour and perfume and fear. She was Elizabeth, daughter of the dead Queen Anne Boleyn, the girl who had grown up watching men weigh women's worth by the thickness of their bloodlines and the smoothness of their throats before the axe. He was Robert Dudley, son of a traitor, born with ambition in his bones and danger in his name. They had both come from the same storm, both marked by fathers who rose too high and fell too hard. He was born in the year 1532, she in 1533, and when they met as children, they could not have known that their names would one day be spoken together in whispers across Europe. In bedchambers and council halls and prisons, they were bound first by fear. During the reign of her half-sister, Mary I, when England was painted in the smoke of Protestant burnings, both Elizabeth and Robert were imprisoned for different reasons, but in the same shadow of suspicion, they learned what it meant to survive by silence, to live by calculation, to measure each glance as if it could be their last in those cold corridors, amid iron and incense. The friendship began to take root between them, not gentle, not sweet, but fierce and necessary, like two flames leaning toward each other in the dark. When Mary died, and Elizabeth took the crown in the winter of 1558, Robert was among the first to kneel. She raised him not as a courtier but as a reflection of herself, naming him Master of Horse, placing him by her side always, as if to remind herself that loyalty and danger often wore the same face. From that day, the court began to murmur. They said the Queen laughed too freely when he spoke. They said her eyes lingered too long when he entered a room. They said that when she danced with him, the music changed. Elizabeth, still barely 25, had inherited a kingdom that doubted her, and a body that the world believed belonged to someone else. Every foreign prince thought she was waiting for him. Every counsellor thought he could choose for her. But in the middle of all their ambitions stood one man who made her forget the game. Robert Dudley was striking, tall and golden, with what the chroniclers called a singular, well-featured countenance and long, shapely legs. He moved like someone who knew he was being watched. She, in turn, was impossible to ignore. Clever, unpredictable, sharp-toned, vain, magnificent. Together they were a spectacle. Wherever she went, he was there at her hunts, her dance, her counsels, her prayers. He rode beside her horse, whispered in her ear, helped her dismount when no one else dared touch her. To the world, it looked like love. To her, it was power dressed as friendship. And perhaps, when the doors were closed, something more dangerous still. The scandal began, as scandals do, with a woman left behind. Robert already had a wife, a gentlewoman named Amy Robsart, whom he had married for passion when they were young. She did not come to court. She lived quietly, far from London. While her husband lived in the glittering sun of royal favour, Elizabeth did not hide her fondness for him. And the kingdom took notice. Old women in taverns gossiped. Maids whispered. Nobles schemed. One, known as Mother Dow of Brentwood, was jailed for saying that Lord Robert had given Her Majesty a red petticoat, a phrase no one needed explained. The Queen was furious, but fury could not silence rumour. Then came the fall. On a September morning in the year 1560, Amy Robsart was found dead at the bottom of a staircase, her neck broken. The house was quiet. There were no witnesses, no signs of struggle, no confession. The story spread like smoke first through servants' corridors, then through parishes, then across the Channel to France. Was it accident? Was it suicide? Was it murder? And if murder, whose hands had done it? Elizabeth locked herself away for days. When she emerged, she spoke only of God's will and the cruelty of chance. She did not see Robert for a time, but the damage was done. The court had smelled blood. There could be no marriage now, not because she did not want it, perhaps she did, but because to marry him would be to invite the whisper that had never left her, that the Virgin Queen had waited for another woman to die. And yet, she could not let him go. Elizabeth, who ruled over men with a tongue of steel, who sent armies across oceans and queens to the scaffold, could not bring herself to banish him completely. "I cannot do without my Lord Robert," she told an ambassador. "He is like my little dog." She gave him titles, wealth, castles. She made him Earl of Leicester. She called him Sweet Robin. The years rolled on, like waves breaking against stone. They quarrelled, drifted, reconciled. He proposed. She deflected. He built her Kenilworth Castle into a paradise of stone and fountains, spending a fortune to please her. When she came to visit in the summer of 1575, he entertained her for 19 days, with fireworks that lit the night for 20 miles, with banquets that lasted until dawn. He planned to propose again that night, in a play he had written, under a sky painted in fire. But rain fell hard, drenching the stage, washing away the moment, and with it, his last real chance. He married again, in secret, twice, once to Lady Sheffield, who bore him a son whose name the Queen never allowed to be spoken, once more to Lettice Knollys, Elizabeth's cousin, the one woman who shared her red hair, her temper, and perhaps her taste. When Elizabeth learned of that second marriage, she erupted. She banished Lettice from court for life, calling her the she-wolf. And though she forgave Robert in public, something colder settled between them. But love, when lived through war and power, is not so easily undone. For 40 years he remained near her, always the first to greet her in the morning, always the last to leave at night. And when the Spanish Armada threatened in the year 1588, it was Robert who arranged her great appearance at Tilbury, where she stood before her army and declared she had the heart and stomach of a king. The words that history remembers were born from the stage he built for her. 2 months later, he was dead, 55 years old, worn out, ill, perhaps with stomach cancer. His last letter to her began, "I most humbly beseech your Majesty to take care of your health, for I fear you are too careless of yourself." When the Queen received the news, she locked herself in her chambers for days. She would see no one. She took his last letter, marked it in her own hand as his last letter, and kept it in a casket by her bedside until she died 15 years later. And so, the Virgin Queen never married, but the truth is that she had already been wed to a shadow, to a scandal, to a love she could neither claim nor kill. Because Elizabeth Tudor belonged to England, but a part of her, the one that history cannot bury, always belonged to Robert Dudley. She was the woman who vanished before history could decide what to do with her. Amy Robsart, wife of Robert Dudley, daughter of a country squire, married at 17 in a fever of youth and promise, and dead by 28 with her neck broken at the bottom of a staircase in a quiet house. While her husband whispered to the Queen, no one saw her fall. No one ever truly explained it. But in that fall, in the quiet thud of bone against wood and the stillness that followed, a door slammed shut on whatever future Elizabeth Tudor might have imagined with Robert Dudley, and something darker slipped in through the cracks. It had begun as most noble marriages did not with love, but with timing. Amy Robsart was not an heiress of great wealth or a woman of political advantage, but she was pretty, warm, educated, well-connected through the Norfolk countryside, and most importantly, available. Robert Dudley, then a young man in the service of King Edward VI. Met her when they were both teenagers. By all accounts, they married for affection, perhaps even passion. He was not yet the man he would become the Queen's favourite, the master of horse, the man history would call Sweet Robin. Back then, he was merely the son of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, a father who was too ambitious for his own bloodline, a man who would soon gamble the throne on a girl named Jane Grey and lose everything. When Robert's father was executed for treason, and he himself imprisoned in the Tower, it was Amy who stood by him. She wrote letters, she waited, she wept, and when he was eventually released, she remained his wife. Though the world they had entered was not the one they had imagined, Mary Tudor was now queen. The Dudleys were disgraced, and Robert had become a man marked by failure, shadowed by his family's betrayal. They moved from estate to estate, never quite wealthy enough, never quite welcome enough, balancing debts with charm, prestige with dwindling favour. Then Mary died, and Elizabeth became queen. Everything changed. Robert rushed to court. Amy did not follow. She remained behind, tucked into rural homes and rented lodgings, seen rarely, heard even less. Meanwhile, Elizabeth named Robert her master of horse, a position that placed him beside her at every occasion. The Queen, barely 25, unmarried, the subject of every European marriage negotiation, had chosen to surround herself with the one man who had nothing left to offer her: no lands, no army, no title, and, crucially, a wife. It did not matter. They rode together, danced, dined, spoke in whispers and gestures and glances, so familiar the court could barely disguise its unease. Rumours began immediately: too many nights, too many smiles, too many moments behind locked doors. But the most potent rumours always have something harder beneath them, something no one wants to name. And in this case, the name was Amy. Amy Robsart was not a fool. She may have been absent from court, but she was not absent from the truth. She knew where her husband was. She knew what the world was saying. Her letters, where they exist, speak of illness, of sadness, of being kept away from her rightful place beside him. Some say she was already dying, that a malady in her breast had hollowed her from the inside, that she was too weak to climb stairs, too ill to stand long, that her death was inevitable, a mercy even. Others say she was depressed, alone, abandonnée, and perhaps, in desperation, flung herself down that final flight. But there is another story, one with no proof, only whispers, that she was murdered, because on the morning of Sunday, the 8th of September, in the year 1560, Amy Robsart insisted that every servant in the house go to the fair, that they leave her alone. She was not well, but she was not afraid. She had her prayers. She said she would rest. They obeyed, and when they returned, she was dead at the foot of the staircase, her neck broken, her headdress undisturbed, her shoes still neat upon her feet. No sign of a struggle, no bruise, no blood, just the soundless verdict of a fall. The coroner's report declared the death an accident. The staircase, they said, had killed her. But the house was not grand. The stairs were not steep. And a broken neck, so clean and final, with no other injury, seemed too convenient for a woman who had become an obstacle. Robert Dudley was not at the house. He was at court, with the Queen. When he received the news, he collapsed. He begged for an immediate inquiry. He demanded a full inquest. He wept, publicly, dramatically, as if to flood the court with innocence. But it was too late. The Queen was no longer just a monarch in danger of scandal. She was now a woman whose favourite's wife had died under strange circumstances. And to marry him would be to confirm what half of Europe already believed, that she had waited for the woman to die. Elizabeth did not marry him. She withdrew, publicly. She began to speak more carefully, to dress more modestly, to remind the world of her virginity, but in private, she kept Robert close, closer than ever. She would not wed him, but she would not let him go. He remained at her side, through rebellions and sickness and suitors from every kingdom. But something had changed. The air between them, once charged with anticipation, now thickened with something more bitter regret. Perhaps, or guilt, or memory. Amy was buried in the chapel of St. Mary at Oxford. Robert did not attend her funeral. Elizabeth never spoke her name again. The red petticoat, the symbol, the rumour, the whispered proof that Robert had taken something that could never be returned, still hung in the minds of the people. They joked of it in taverns, painted it into plays, carried it like a stain across every portrait of the Queen, because no matter how many titles Robert was given, no matter how long he stood at her side, there would always be the shadow of the staircase. And the woman who fell, was it murder, was it despair, was it illness or accident or fate, we do not know. We will never know. The truth slipped down with her, cracking at the base of the stair, vanishing into the silence that followed. But from that moment on, Elizabeth was never quite the same. She smiled less, laughed more carefully, danced with him. Yes, but slower now, as if each step reminded her of a misstep taken by someone else. She wore the crown like a shield, and built her legend around the space where her marriage might have been. And Robert remained, always at her side, always just a little too close, but never close enough to call her wife, because Amy had fallen, and Elizabeth had risen on the wind that followed. The crown was heavy. Even when it was not on her head, it sat on cushions and was carried in ceremony, displayed with reverence, whispered about in secret. But for Elizabeth, it was never just gold and jewels. It was a wound. It reminded her of the mother who died for it, the father who destroyed her name, the sister who locked her away, and the child she never became. When she wore it, she was no longer the daughter of Anne Boleyn, nor the girl who once trembled in the tower, nor the woman who might have loved too boldly and too soon. When she wore the crown, she became something untouchable, and yet, beside her always, there was one man who reached through that untouchability, who stood beside the crown, not with awe, but with memory. Robert Dudley. He was the one who had known her before the weight, before the legend, before the armour of state had hardened around her like glass. She had become queen in the year 1558. And on that very morning, before the bells had finished ringing and the crowds had quieted, he was there, not kneeling, not bowing, just there, and he would remain, for days, for years, for decades. He was her master of horse, a title that gave him not just proximity, but intimacy. He controlled her travel, her stables, her daily movement. He decided who approached, who lingered, who was dismissed, wherever she went. He followed not in shadow, not in servitude, but in something far more complex. He was her constant, her mirror, her courtier and confidant, a man who had known her as a prisoner and now stood beside her as a sovereign. And the court watched. They watched how she laughed when he entered a room, how she leaned toward him in conversation, how she took his hand in the privacy of gardens and behind curtains embroidered with gold thread. They watched how she called him Sweet Robin, how he spoke to her with familiarity no other man dared, how she turned cold when he was absent. They counted the minutes they spent together. They wrote it in letters to foreign courts. Ambassadors reported every touch, every glance, every moment she sat too near. And Robert did not shrink from it. He was not afraid of scandal. He had lived through worse. There was something magnetic in him, not just in the smoothness of his face or the length of his limbs or the way he moved through rooms like someone who owned them, but in his certainty. He did not question her. He did not challenge the rightness of her power. He believed in her, not as woman or myth, but as force, and she returned that faith, not with declarations, but with the slow accumulation of trust. She gave him Kenilworth Castle. She made him Earl of Leicester. She ensured he sat at the highest tables, that his opinion was heard, that his name was spoken with reverence, and still, they never married, because they couldn't, because of Amy, because of the stairs, because of the crown, and because Elizabeth, though she may have loved him, understood better than anyone what marriage would mean. It would mean power shared, or worse, surrendered it. It would mean becoming wife instead of queen, consort instead of monarch. And she had seen what happened to queens who gave too much. She had seen it in her mother's severed head, in her cousin Mary's prison cell, in every woman whose name had vanished after a man stepped too close. So she kept him, but at arm's length. And Robert, whatever his longing, whatever his ambition, never truly left her side. Even when she denied him, even when she sent him away in anger, even when he married others in secret and faced her wrath like a ship facing storm, he returned, again and again, and she let him. There were mirrors in her palace, long ones, with frames of gilt and glass that had come from Venice and Flanders, polished until they showed every crack in a woman's skin. Every line, earned by statecraft and sleeplessness. Elizabeth studied herself often. She watched the years creep in. The thinning hair, the hollowed cheeks. She added paint, powder, wig, jewels. She became the image of majesty. But when Robert stood beside her, she did not flinch, because he had seen her when she was just Elizabeth, because he had known her face before the mask, because, perhaps, she needed someone to remind her who she had been before. England claimed her as its bride. He walked with her through victories and failures, through the death of Mary, Queen of Scots, through the Armada, through the rebellions, through the endless parade of foreign suitors. She laughed off the Archduke Charles, dismissed the Duke of Anjou, refused every king who offered a crown beside hers. And through all of it, Robert remained unmarried in her eyes, untouched by her refusals. Still, the one man she trusted in rooms where men spoke of war and gold and empire. But it was not a love story. Not in the way poets would write it. It was something harder, sadder, more enduring. It was a loyalty forged in prison, fed by politics, tempered by scandal. It was a closeness that defied logic, a bond that survived betrayal, separation, and silence. They did not touch where others could see, but there were nights when her windows remained lit longer than the rest, and no one was allowed to enter. We do not know if they were lovers in body. Elizabeth swore to her dying breath that she had remained untouched. She died, she said, as she had lived a virgin, and perhaps that is true. But intimacy is not measured only in flesh. It is measured in glances that last too long, in letters kept by a bed for 15 years, in grief that locks a queen behind closed doors when the only man she could not lose is lost. Robert Dudley died in the year 1588, 2 months after he orchestrated her glorious speech at Tilbury, 2 months after he stood beneath her as she proclaimed her courage before the English army. He fell ill and passed quietly at Cornbury Park. And when the news reached the Queen, she vanished from view. For days, she would not eat, would not speak, would not allow the doors to open. They found her holding a letter, his last. She wrote upon it with trembling ink, his last letter, and kept it near her until the day she died. In the year 1603, he had not been her husband, but he had been her mirror And in that mirror, for 40 years, she had seen the one thing England could never give her: unquestioned love. It was winter when he tried to ask her for the last time. Not in secret, not in shame, but in splendor, with trumpets and dancers, and a castle lit by torches that burned through snow. He had waited for years, swallowing silence, bearing the weight of scandal, standing at her shoulder through coronations and councils and whispers behind every velvet curtain. He had watched other men come and go, suitors with stronger claims, kings with ships and jewels and armies, and still she had chosen none of them. Not one. Only him. Again and again, in the small things, in the closeness, in the way her letters always found him first. Her eyes sought him first. Her laughter rang louder when he was in the room. He thought perhaps it had been enough, that perhaps this time finally it would be yes. It was the winter of the year, 1575. He had planned it all. Kenilworth Castle, his jewel in the Midlands, had been transformed into something otherworldly. Courtyards flooded into mirror-like pools, gardens carved into mazes and platforms for music, fireworks designed to bloom across the sky in perfect harmony, to spell out loyalty and love above her head. He had spent more than a king would have dared, because he was not a king, and he needed her to see what kings could not give. She arrived in July, but the air held the dampness of a late spring that refused to yield. It rained for days. Her visit, meant to be a brief gesture of favour, stretched into 19 full days, the longest she would ever spend in the home of a subject. He built new lodgings for her within the castle walls. Leicester's building, they called it. It had views of the water garden and hidden staircases and rooms gilded with imported oak and paintings that whispered of majesty. Every evening was filled with revelry. Boots, masks, courtiers in embroidered silks, actors who performed for her until dawn. And still, she did not say yes. He had prepared the final night carefully, a dramatic play with a final scene in which a queen was urged to marry her noble suitor. A tent had been constructed in the lower gardens, and a speech written beautiful, tragic, triumphant. It would end with a question. He would not say the words himself. He would let the stage speak for him, let the theatre be his shield. But that afternoon, the rain came down so hard it shattered the tent. The actors fled. The script was ruined. The earth turned to mud. The firewood could not be lit. And Elizabeth, who hated dampness and delay more than anything, grew cold. She would not wait. She rode away the next morning. And Dudley, standing in the wreckage of soaked silks and broken props, watched the one chance he had so carefully constructed vanish like smoke. She had known. Of course she had known. She always knew. She had read the pauses in his letters, the rehearsals in his eyes. She had seen the way his hands trembled when he handed her a gift, the way his smile dimmed when she spoke too long with another man. She had known for years what he wanted, and she had never said no, but she had never said yes. That was her way. She did not choose. She lingered. She held him close and kept him far. She gave him everything but her hand, and perhaps that was the cruelest part. Because Robert had tried to build a world around her, a castle that might hold not just her crown but her heart. He had gambled everything on spectacle, and she had slipped away before the final act. But she did not abandon him. When he returned to court, she received him warmly, as if nothing had happened, as if the rain had washed away not only the proposal but the pain. She thanked him for his hospitality. She praised the fireworks. She made mention of how beautiful the lake had looked from her window. She laughed. She touched his sleeve. She reminded him and everyone else that whatever they were, it was not over. He did not ask again. Not directly, but he stayed, even after she rejected him, even after she married him off in her mind to Mary, Queen of Scots, even after he made his own choices dangerous, secret, irreversible, He returned to her side, because no one else could take his place. She would not allow it, and so the storm passed. The castle dried. The curtains were packed away. The actors moved on. The court forgot. But he remembered. He remembered how the air had smelled that night, how close he had come, how the future had stretched before him for one breathless moment, and then vanished. And she remembered too, because she never returned to Kenilworth again. It remained a monument to the question that had never been answered, to the marriage that never happened, to the crown she never set aside, and to the man who built a stage for her and stood waiting. In the rain, she had always hated reflections that came too close. The Queen, Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, sovereign over England and master of her own myth, could tolerate many things. Flattery, poetry, portraits painted kinder than truth. But what she could not bear was the sight of herself repeated in another woman's eyes, especially when that woman was younger, especially when that woman was beautiful, especially when that woman had dared to marry her Robin. Lettice Knollys was not just any rival. She was blood, first cousin to the Queen through Mary Boleyn, sister to Elizabeth's executed mother. She had red hair too. She had the Boleyn chin. She had a way of walking into a room that made men straighten their backs. But most of all, she had done what Elizabeth had never forgiven. She had stood beside Robert Dudley, not in shadows or courtly whispers, but as his wife. It was done in secret, in the year 1578. At Wanstead, in the quiet green reaches beyond London, without royal permission, without heralds or trumpets, without so much as a servant dispatched to the Queen, Robert knew what he was doing. He had waited too long. His last hope of marrying Elizabeth had been rained out at Kenilworth. She had refused him again and again, always with affection, always with softness, but never with what he needed. And now, perhaps, Lettice offered something Elizabeth never could: certainty. The marriage was quiet, but secrets, like mirrors, crack eventually. Someone whispered it into the wrong ear. Someone sent word to court, and Elizabeth, who had governed a kingdom, outlived rebellion, stared down. Kings and parliaments did not scream. She did not weep, but her silence was thick enough to drown in. Lettice arrived at court weeks later, gilded and graceful, expecting perhaps a scolding, perhaps a cold welcome. But she was met with fire. The Queen did not greet her. The Queen did not look at her. The Queen summoned her. And when she arrived, Elizabeth fixed her cousin with a stare that burned more cruelly than any exile. As but one sun lightens the sky, the Queen said, her voice low, so I will have but one Queen of England. Lettice was never seen at court again. She was banished not to a tower, not to a scaffold, but to the quieter punishment of erasure. She was erased from the Queen's eyes, from her dances, from her feasts, from the tight little world that revolved around her radiant fury. She was not allowed to share air with her cousin again. But Robert was not punished. Not in the same way. He was scolded. Yes, banished for a time. Perhaps, but he was forgiven. Slowly, carefully, grudgingly, inevitably, because the Queen could not lose him. Not even now. She needed him. Still, because Robin was not just a man, he was a thread woven into every part of her reign. He was her mirror, her witness, the one who remembered the girl behind the crown. And even after he had chosen someone else, even after he had married a face too close to her own, she brought him back. She let him return. But something had changed. The warmth between them cooled. The private smiles grew fewer. The dances became more formal. The glances shorter. The conversations more clipped. Robert stood by her. But he no longer belonged only to her. And she, though she never admitted it, felt the loss like a dagger tucked beneath her bodice. Because Lettice had taken something sacred, not Robert's body, he had given that to others before. Not his name, Elizabeth, had let that pass too. But his vow, his possibility, the question he had asked her with every silent moment, every castle built, every gaze across a crowded court, Lettice had taken the question Elizabeth had never answered, and married it. Years passed. Lettice bore him a child, a son named Robert, after his father, a boy with ambition in his eyes, but the Queen would never acknowledge him. He was not to be seen, not to be spoken of, a shadow child from a shadow marriage. Elizabeth reigned on. She aged. Her face powdered more thickly. Her gowns grew more elaborate. But she never forgot. And she never forgave. Not the cousin who looked too much like her. Not the man who married her anyway. The Queen who had given Robert Dudley her trust, her favour, her endless forgiveness, could not bear to look at the woman who had taken him, not in rumour or poetry or courtly game, but in reality. So Lettice Knollys disappeared from the court, and Elizabeth stepped once more into the light, the only sun allowed to shine. There was a castle in Warwickshire, where history held its breath, Kenilworth. They called it a sprawl of red stone and gilded chambers, of rising towers and silver fountains, a place rebuilt for one purpose alone, to dazzle a queen. It was not made for war. It was not made for rule. It was made for her. Every brick laid with reverence, every chamber painted with her name, every garden trimmed and sculpted to please her eyes. And in the centre of it all, Robert Dudley waited. Elizabeth arrived in the summer of 1575. It was not her first visit, but it would be the longest, and it would be the last. He had prepared everything. The roads were cleared, the hedgerows replanted, the moat drained and lined with smooth stone. A new wing had been added, Leicester's building. They called it designed only for her, with rooms that caught the sunrise and windows wide enough to watch the fireworks he would launch across the sky. She arrived on horseback, wrapped in pearls and silk, her hair set like flame, her eyes already calculating. She knew what this was. She knew what Robert wanted. But still she came. She smiled. She walked beside him through the rose gardens. She sat beside him at table. She watched his actors perform plays beneath twilight skies, and allowed her ladies to swoon at the music. But she did not say yes. Each day was a ritual. Mornings spent in the gardens, afternoons on progress, evenings in Leicester's hall, with torches burning and harpists playing and courtiers watching them like actors on a stage. Robert, always near her elbow. Elizabeth, always just beyond reach. There were rooms within the castle. No one entered. Doors guarded not by soldiers, but by silence. And on certain nights, when the stars were especially bright, a single candle was seen glowing behind the shuttered windows of the Queen's chamber long after the court had gone to bed. No one ever said what passed in those hours. Not the guards, not the maids, not the Queen herself, but the court knew how to count days, 19 of them. Elizabeth remained for 19 nights under Dudley's roof, her longest stay in any subject's home. Too long for diplomacy, too long for courtesy. And in the mornings, she would rise early and walk alone through the gardens. The Queen, who rarely did anything without audience, slipped between hedges and fountains like a girl escaping a convent. She paused by the lake he had cleared for her. She touched the roses he had bred to match her lips. And she said nothing. Robert said little either. He watched. He smiled. He offered gestures instead of pleas. The pageants, the musicians, the fireworks, they were his words now. And they spoke what he could. Not that this castle was not merely a home, but a question. Would she stay? Would she say yes? But she never did. The final night was meant to be the grandest, a masque written to charm her, a final scene in which a queen marries her loyal servant, a last attempt But the rain came. It swept across the gardens like judgment. The stage collapsed. The actors fled. The torches hissed and died. And Elizabeth, laughing but unmoved, ordered her carriage to be made ready. She left before dawn. He stood beneath the archway and watched her go. And though he saw her again, though he stood at her side for many more years, though he walked behind her throne and kissed her hand and was forgiven again and again, she never returned to Kenilworth. The castle remained, but it became something else, no longer a question, but a memory, a place where she had walked. Yes, but also a place she had chosen to leave. The nights they spent there were never spoken of. Not by her, not by him, not even in their letters. And when ambassadors asked, when poets inquired, when courtiers whispered, she answered only with silence and a smile too polished to break. She would speak of Kenilworth's beauty, of its pageants, of the gardens, but never of the nights. And so we are left with that silence. A silence filled with the scent of roses and candle smoke and summer rain. A silence that says she may have loved him, and also that she could never be his. Because Kenilworth was not just a castle. It was the space between them, magnificent, impossible, and haunted. There are ghosts that walk through palaces, not in the form of shadows or whispers, but in the faces of children who should never have been born, and in the women who were never meant to matter. For Elizabeth Tudor, it was not the sight of blood that unnerved her, nor the sound of blades, nor the weight of crowns she had grown used to those things long before she could write her name. But there were two things she could never quite banish: a boy who bore the name of the man she could not marry, and a woman whose very existence stood as proof that she had never truly possessed him. The woman was Lady Douglas Sheffield. She was not royal. She was not famous. She was not, at first, even a threat. She was a widow young, graceful, and in mourning when she caught the eye of Robert Dudley. Sometime around the year 1573, the Queen was still radiant then, still feared, still adored, and Dudley still stood at her side. His name murmured with both reverence and rumour, but Elizabeth had refused him once again. Kenilworth had failed. The mask had collapsed. The rain had washed the stage clean, and Robert, for all his charm and waiting, had grown tired of waiting alone. Lady Sheffield was not a seduction. She was a refuge, a private moment in a life made entirely of spectacle. There were meetings, there were letters, there were weeks when he did not return to court, and the Queen's eyes narrowed, and her voice chilled. And then there was a child, a boy, Robert Dudley, named after his father, born in secret, raised in shadow. The Queen was not told, not yet, not for years, because Robert Dudley, the father, claimed the child. Yes, but not the woman. He did not marry her, or if he did, he denied it later. She would insist, later still, that they had been wed in a private ceremony. He would say it never happened. Historians have argued for centuries. The papers were missing. The priest was missing. The truth drowned somewhere between memory and reputation. But the boy lived, and in his living, he became a wound. Because when the Queen finally heard of him, it was not from Robert. It was not even from the court. It was from a whisper, a passing command, a name spoken too loudly in the wrong corridor. She asked questions. She received answers she had not prepared for, and her silence after that was not the silence of shock. It was rage, quiet, controlled, glacial. Because Robert had betrayed her not with lust, she had forgiven that before, but with something deeper. He had created a future without her. A son, a name passed on, a branch that did not include the crown, and the woman Lady Sheffield carried not just the child, but the shame. She had dared to touch what was never meant to be touched. She had dared to make it real. The Queen could not destroy the boy, but she erased the woman Douglas Sheffield was never welcome at court again. Her son was kept far from the centre of things. No titles, no honours, no affection. Even when he grew older, even when he wrote to the Queen in pleading, humble tones, she answered only with silence. But Robert did not forget him. He funded his education, protected him from a distance, watched his growth with pride and pain, and when Robert Dudley died in the year 1588, it was not the Queen who claimed his legacy. It was the boy. He stepped forward. Robert Dudley, the younger. And though Elizabeth allowed it, what else could she do? She never looked him in the eye, because he was the life she had refused to live, the child she had never born, the proof that her Robin had once loved another in flesh, if not in heart. And though the Queen ruled for another 15 years, and though she called herself married to her country, and though her bed remained empty by design, there was a space beside her that only one man had ever filled. And now, that man had left behind a son, a boy who carried his name, and a woman who carried his shame. There are moments that linger longer than lifetimes. One letter, one ride, one silence that swallows everything that came before. For Elizabeth Tudor, Queen of England, mistress of an empire held together by pageantry and will, the moment came in autumn, in the year 1588, when the man she had once loved beyond logic and above law vanished from her life in the way he had always threatened to without asking permission. She had known he was unwell. His letters had grown shorter, his visits less frequent. The summer had taken its toll, and with it the burdens of war and age and regret. But he had always recovered before. He had always returned. So when he sent her that final note, hurried, affectionate, filled with concern for her health, not his own, she read it without fear. I most humbly beseech your majesty to take care of your precious self. It began, and it ended with his name. No title, no pretense, just Robert. She placed it on her table. She would answer it later. But there was no later. Within days, word came to court. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, Master of Horse, the companion of the Queen for nearly 40 years, was dead. He had died at Cornbury Park, in Oxfordshire, quietly. There was no grand ceremony. No crowd gathered. He had simply slipped away, worn thin by illness, likely of the stomach. Some said, or a broken heart. Others whispered, and when Elizabeth heard, she did not faint. She did not cry. She simply stood still. Then she turned, and locked herself behind her chamber doors. For days, no one was allowed in. Not her ladies, not her counsellors, not even her closest companions. Food was left untouched. Candles burned to the wick. The court waited in muffled unease as the Queen, who had buried monarchs and lovers and enemies without flinching, now buried a part of herself too deep to name. They say she was found sitting on the floor, dressed in black, with Robert's last letter held in both hands. She had written across the envelope, in her own clear, deliberate hand, his last letter. She kept it by her bedside until the day she died, because though they had never married, though they had never worn the crowns of husband and wife, though she had sworn to her dying breath that she remained the Virgin Queen, there had been only one man she ever let that close. And now he was gone. After a time, she returned to her court. Her face was thinner, her gowns darker, the pearls more plentiful, as if to drown grief in ritual. She laughed when she had to. She spoke when the state required it. She sent gifts. She penned letters. She ruled as she always had, with fire beneath frost. But the light behind her eyes had dimmed, and though she never said his name aloud again, something in her had closed forever. She kept his rooms untouched, his portrait in a private gallery, his memory guarded like state treasure, and when his widow, Lettice Knollys, the cousin Elizabeth, had banished dared to request audience, dared to plead her case. The Queen's reply was a glance, a cold turning of the shoulder, a door shut again, because some griefs are too private to speak, and some betrayals never uncoil, even after death. But she never turned that coldness on Robert's memory. Not once. She held the letter. She spoke of his loyalty. Once, to a foreign ambassador, she called him "my sweet Robin." And though she took new favourites, young men with poetry and golden curls, none of them stood where Robert had stood. None of them saw her before the crown. None of them knew the girl who had lived through fire to wear it. When Elizabeth herself died in the year 1603, the letter was still beside her, folded, worn, untouched. The last ride had been his, but the last silence belonged to her, and behind the golden doors of her palace, in chambers, no man could enter without permission. The Queen shut herself away from the world, not to rule, not to dazzle, not to defend a throne, but to remember there are queens who live in triumph, and queens who live in tragedy. Elizabeth Tudor lived in both. She was crowned by fire, ruled by fear, adored by some, despised by others, and remembered by all. They called her the Virgin Queen, the Gloriana, the Fairy Queen. They painted her with suns behind her head and globes beneath her feet. They sang of her as if she were not flesh, as if she were not a woman, as if she had never wept for one man who stood too close, too long, and died too far away. But beneath the paint and the pearls, beneath the armour of speeches and the gold thread of her gowns, there was a silence that only Robert Dudley could fill. For 40 years, she had stood at the centre of a world that measured her worth by her ability to remain untouched. And she had agreed to the bargain. She had worn the crown instead of the ring. She had given England her body only as an image, never as a promise. She told the world she was married to her country. But what the world never saw, what no parliament ever voted on, was the space she kept beside her, in every room, the echo she allowed to live behind every decision. Robert Dudley had been her mirror, her shadow, her favourite. But more than that, he had been the only one who saw her as something smaller than legend and never loved her less for it. He had seen her in mourning, in fury, in defiance, in laughter. He had seen her as prisoner and princess, as monarch and woman. He had known the girl who feared the tower, the woman who feared no one, and the sovereign who feared only herself. He had waited, for years, for permission, for a yes that never came. And when he married another, she banished the woman, but forgave the man. When he gave her no child, she still gave him her trust. When he died, she gave him what she had denied him in life, her full, unguarded grief. And then she shut the door, because even queens are allowed to mourn in private. They buried her at Westminster Abbey in the spring of 1603. Her coffin was placed above her sister Mary's, two daughters of the same tyrant. Now, silent, side by side, but buried with her was the letter, his last letter. The ink faded, the paper folded, worn smooth by years of being touched. Reread, remembered. She had kept it beside her through every speech, every triumph, every loss, through the rise of Spain, the fall of Mary, the courtships she declined, the battles she won. It was not a treaty. It was not scripture. It was simply his name. And in that name lived everything she could not say aloud. That she had loved, that she had chosen not to love freely, that she had given her body to no one, but had built a country in the shape of her longing, because England had needed her pure, unwed, unbroken. So she gave them the image they required. But in the private, quiet corners of her nights, she slept in memory, not in guilt, not in sorrow, but in something more complex. She had chosen to rule, and she had done it better than any man before her. But her crown, though heavy, had always been steadied by one unseen hand, and when he was gone, the weight became harder to bear. She had said she was married to her people, and they believed her. But the truth, the soft truth, the truth that lives only in candlelight and between folded pages, is that Elizabeth Tudor, the most powerful woman in the world, had given her heart to the one man she could never truly have, and in doing so, had taught the world that love need not be owned to be eternal. That memory, when cherished, can be louder than a marriage. That sometimes the most enduring love story is the one that was never written in law but in silence.